Okay. Hello and welcome everyone to the SMPTE presentation in June here. Today's presentation from Sencore. Blaze will be talking about the SDI2X, solution for bridging the gap between IP and SDI infrastructure. The presentation is basically about control and operation and web interface on the device, along with a small presentation of it in action, and then follow with a question and answer period. So saying that, Blaze, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Mark. So just to get right into it here, we're talking about the SDI2X today. That's mainly just a gateway that can go between SDI to either 2110 or 22.6 and vice versa. Okay. So just to talk a bit about Sencore, we were founded in 1951. We're currently working out of Sioux Falls over here and have been for a long time. We've gone through number of different phases, and we cycled out of testing equipment and other things along those lines some time ago, and lately we've been making mainly broadcast equipment and other things like that for networking. And I started here about 2 years ago. I worked in our support department over in ProCare, and recently moved to sales about 3 months ago. So just to kind of talk about what we're looking at today, just a kind of quick overview of what the SDI2X is, what it can do, and then also just to describe what that front panel looks like and how it can interact with the system, and then all the different ports in the back panel, and then just a bit about the two different types of uncompressed IP it can take out, and then just a little information about how to set it up and what the web UI looks like. And then as Mark mentioned, I'll have a little sort of demo, or a web-based demo, so to speak, so you can see what it looks like and how it works. So just to kind of talk about what the SDI2X is, it's kind of as we described earlier, it's just meant to convert SDI to IP or uncompressed IP to SDI. It mainly interacts with the 2022.6 and 2110 protocols. I've got a little description there on the different options. There's that unit on the right there, that topmost picture. That's our 4-channel third RU unit, but there's a form factor for that can just do 1 channel, so just have 1 SDI port on the back instead. And we also have an AG implementation of it, so it can fit in our CRD chassis, and you can populate that with 10 cards for a more dense operation of up to 40 channels even. We've also got some options for 2022.7 if you need to back up that uncompressed IP across 2 different network infrastructures. And a lot of our Sencore devices, they're known for having pretty intuitive front panel operation, and the web UI is always very straightforward. We've got some good protocols for automation in the form of SNMP and REST API. And we always have our support team that's there to help too if you have any questions or technical problems. Any questions so far on how that looks?
No,
okay. So just to get right into it, we'll talk about the front panel. This mainly applies to the 1 and the 4 channel options, the third RU unit. That's mainly just used for steering if you need to have a tech on site that can just do a quick change on the fly or a quick status check on the front panel through that LED. It's used to mainly do control with the LED keys, or the keys on the right there, and then the LED can be used to display all kinds of stuff like the IP of the unit and then incoming bit rates and things along those lines. There's this sort of input and error LED. Those are to help you determine whether or not the unit has input and if the unit's currently in an erroneous state without having to log into it. And then this is kind of where all the data that would be described as that LED screen. And then the keys are fairly straightforward, just up and down to cycle through the menus, and then left, right, and enter to go through them, and things along those lines. Any questions about that so far? All right. So the back panel, I'm going to mainly talk about the third RU because this is the one that there's the most interest in. But that's just to describe all the different ports and how they all interact. So over on the far left here, we've got that power supply, and that's compatible with that 120 to 240 volts AC. We have a dedicated management Ethernet port on the back that goes up to a gig if needed. And then we also have in this particular one, this is the 4 channel. So we have 4 different SDI IO ports. So each of those goes to its own channel on the system, either configured as SDI in to IP out, or vice versa with IP in to SDI out. And then there's also an HDMI out port. So if you have a monitor that you need to just look at a particular channel on at a given time, you can see what that IP looks like just by assigning that channel to the HDMI out port for some side monitoring. And then these are the 2 data ports here, and those kind of work in tandem with the SDI channels. So you could do your SDI in, and this is where your IP would come out in that case, or you could do IP in, and that would go out to one of the 4 SDI ports. All the input and output, that's all handled on the back side of the unit. So the 1 channel would be almost the exact same as this, except there's just 1 SDI port. And then the AG implementation is very similar to this. It's just kind of stacked differently in a way that it would fit with the back plane, but I don't think it has that HDMI out port. Any questions so far? All right. So next I'll talk about just the 2 different types of uncompressed IP that SDI2X handles, and just a little description of what they are and how they're different. It's not super high level, but just to kind of describe how you'd use them. So we got our 2022.6 versus our 2110. That 2022.6 is basically just wrapping that SDI in IP so that it can be carried over either that fiber, 10 gig SFP, things along those lines. It's a lot more straightforward, and it's just basically sending it with a light wrapping of that IP so that it can be transmitted over that distance. The 2110 is a little more involved. That one, it kind of divides up the different types of data that come in on that SDI, the audio, the video, the ANC data, and it sends them out almost kind of like the way a TS works, where you just have different sort of elementary streams, and it allows for you to have a little more flexibility to work on different components of it at a given time. You do need to have a PTP time source on that network in order to put it all together correctly once it reaches its destination. That's not the case on the 2022.6, but that's all, again, just kind of put all together on that 1 IP output. And we're capable of doing one or the other on a given channel. So you could have like 2022.6 on channel 1 and 2110 on channel 2 if you wanted to try out and see which one works different. But for today, we're mainly talking about 2110 since that's the implementation that Mark's looking at. All right. So just kind of get right into the practical of it. Like if you get your unit for the first time, just how to set it up and how you would go about logging in. So that back panel there, that management port, you would just configure yourself for a matching IP address for whatever your network would hand off to it. If you have a need for a direct connection or a static IP, you can assign that through the front panel on arrival. But typically it's pretty fast. You just plug it into your network and then it'll grab its IP address via the DHCP that's handed off by the network. And you just tune to that with your PC or your laptop. So once you get there, the first thing that you'll see is that login prompt there. Our default credentials are always admin and MPEG 101. And once you log in, then that'll kind of take you to the web GUI, which I'll show you very shortly here after I show the demo diagram, so to speak. All right. So this is just kind of what I have set up for you today to describe and demonstrate how that SDI to IP and back to SDI works. Mark's particular use case that he's looking at, that he's interested in, is he just wants 2 separate distinct channels. 2 of them will be SDI in to IP out, but then he also has a separate line for 2 IP in to SDI out. And so to kind of capture that exact thing, I just set up an MRD 5800. It's one of our conventional IRDs with an IP input. And that has 2 separate, distinct, but identical SDI outputs that are going to 2 channels on the SDI2X. And so then those will turn around and send IP out, as you can see on that Unit 1, Port 1. And I have the data ports on 2 separate SDI2X units connected to the same network switch as my PTP time source, which in our case is the SPG 8000A. It's very common. A lot of people use it. I know that's what Mark plans to use, and it's kind of what we've dealt with a lot over in ProCare. And so from there, it'll route the IP to SDI on a separate unit, and that unit will then turn it back around again as SDI, or it'll turn it around as IP, which will then send out as SDI, and I have that being monitored on an Omnitech monitor downstream. So that kind of just shows you all the different points in the journey of SDI to IP, back to IP to SDI, and then I can kind of manipulate that and view the effects on an Omnitech. Any questions about that diagram before we get into it? All right. So I'm just going to kind of pull up a tab here that I have for my my different units that I have set up in that signal path. Is everyone able to see that web GUI okay?
Yeah, it looks good here.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So here I have the MRD 5800. That's just receiving your MPEG over IP, and it's handling a decode, and it's putting it out on those 2 SDI ports. This is the first of my 2 SDI2Xs in that signal path. So just kind of going back to so that'd be right around here pretty much on that. And then put it in kind of a precarious position. There we go. Then the second one will be kind of handling that bounce back on the same stream. So basically, the first unit will be SDI to IP. That second unit receives the IP and then will fork the SDI back out. And I have that looping into itself, so I can just send IP back to this first unit so that you can see SDI to IP and then also IP to SDI at the end of it. And I also have a remote session with my Omnitech monitor, so you can view those 2 different channels, the endpoint there, the 2 different SDI outputs. And so just to kind of describe these different tabs, after you finish logging in, this will kind of be the first thing that you see, the SMPTE tab. And again, this is the 3rd RU unit, so you might see 1 channel on the 1 RU, or on the 1 channel RU unit, whatever have you, and then you'd see kind of a very similar view on the AG form factor that has 4 channels as well. But this is where you go to do a majority of that configuration for the actual conversion going from SDI to IP and so on. And you can also configure your HDMI output there. I'll go a bit into the admin tab as well before going too much further, because there's some stuff that's important there to configure before you get too far into it as well. Once you finish getting your DHCP address, if you want to change it to something that's native to your static, you can also change it here on the web GUI, similar to on the front panel. That way, if you have something that you need to stay at after a reboot or something like that, you can come back to it that way. The video IP network is an important point to configure, because this is where you go to configure your PTP clock. So my PTP domain for my my time sync on this network, it's 127. So we just go to do our configure card, and then that's where you'd go to dial that in, so it knows to look for that particular domain to sync up with as it's putting its IP out and receiving. This genlock state, it's for phase lock. So if your PTP time sync, for instance, is set to 2997 primarily, and you get an inherent offset if you have someone that insists on a 25 frames per second stream, you can kind of keep track of how far off it is, and you can use that genlock state to create that manual displacement with these settings, or I should say phase lock. And you can also configure your 2022-7 settings here too, so you can enable that, and then all your streams would go out on 2 different ports instead of just the 1, so that you'd have your 2 separate network architectures for that SDI turnaround. All right, so then we've got our 4 different channels in this particular case. I'm just going to get into the sort of configure channel settings, and then how it looks like to convert configure that IP output, and then also what it looks like to configure the IP input. So these are all kind of pre-baked, so to speak. Like I put them all together ahead of time. But to configure it either for SDI to IP or IP to SDI, not both. So basically, this is a converter, so it wouldn't take like an IP from one and output on a separate IP port elsewhere, or take like a SDI on one and output SDI elsewhere. This would be strictly for going from that SDI to that uncompressed IP, or from taking an uncompressed IP and then getting it ready to be sent out as SDI again. You can name the channels if you want to have them correlate to a specific stream, or if you're tracking a particular anomaly or something along those lines, you can name it that here. And then also, this is where you go to choose whether you want it to be a 2022-6 output or a 2110. I'm going to keep it as 2110 for the time being, since that's what we're mainly looking at. But if I were to change IP to SDI, then it would just change kind of the way it looks from this first channel here to match more similar to what we have down here on channel 3. So once you have that selected, you can kind of view a little bit of information about that incoming SDI. Once you acquire that lock, you can confirm that it's HD. You can get the video format on the incoming and the information about the audio that's coming in, as well as any ancillary data that might or might not be activated on that SDI at a given time. And so when I go to put my IP output together, you get a bit of a better idea of what you're about to be putting into those separate components, right? And so basically, when you go to configure this output, you'll configure 3 separate distinct streams, each one for the video, audio, and data. And that's just part of how the 2110 output works. If I had the 2022-6, it would be a little more straightforward. It would just be, one destination IP to one. But with that 2110, we carry them all on separate lines. And you can also have it go out on either port 2 or 3. And just kind of keeping in mind that seamless option I showed you on the admin tab. If that one's up, then you'd send them both on port 2 and 3. But just for the sake of bandwidth, I have them just going on port 2 on the output side. And then I'm receiving on port 3 on the input side. All right. So after this goes SDI to IP out, that second unit, it looks very similar to the first. It's just kind of inverted to show the way that it's being sent in and out. So I just pick it up with that same input settings. So I have my IP to SDI configured on the channel settings. I have it set for 2110, and therefore I get the options to manually enter in the addressing for my video, audio, and ENC addressing schemes. You can choose it to be auto for an SDP, but just for the sake of it, I always prefer to use manual, because that way, if something changes upstream or whatever have you, I can always just keep it the same way. I don't have it jumping back and forth, because I tend to use just the same kind of stream for everything. We also have de-jitter settings, so if you're expecting any kind of network jitter or other problems that could cause a higher IAT or burstiness on the network, we do have a sort of buffer you can set aside for helping to get around that. So we usually use high tolerance just to make it the most robust. It adds 150 milliseconds of latency, which is the highest of all the different kinds. If you have a pretty trustworthy network, you can go lower. It's up to you, but we kind of figure, since we're already in the uncompressed realm, that latency is so low, we're okay with just kind of taking the maximum de-jitter by default, but something to keep in mind while you're working with it. And then just kind of going back, similar to the other unit, you can choose which connector you want it to be on, port 2 or port 3. And then if you were doing seamless, then it would be both, of course. So any questions about that so far?
Not yet.
Okay. So pretty much I just have, like I mentioned, this guy kind of loops on himself. And so I take that SDI output port, and then I go to channel 3 and 4 in here. That way I can do my full SDI to IP and IP to SDI on just one unit on the other side. And so after I take that SDI to IP, which is sourced by 1 in this case, then that comes back over here. And by extension, if I were to say disable this particular receive channel, then I could, or I should say disable the output channel. Then I would see the effects occur on the full signal path. There we go. And so just to come back to my SDI monitor that I have set up on the side, that I input 1 correlates to my channel 3 over here. It might just take a second. And my I input 2 is for channel 4, which I've currently left running. Just a moment. I wonder if the other components are, if I need to disable the others. Uh-oh. All right, just a second. My share options, they're all right in the line of that that tab there. Just a second. Just trying to get this thing out of the way. There we go. All right, so I got that showing the error, which is good. Put stream loss. So I think what it's doing is it's still sending out a black raster, and that's why I still have a channel coming in on that second unit. That's coming in on here. Yep, so that I input there on the bottom shows the 1080i, so that's why I still see an SDI output. That makes sense. Okay, there we go. All right, so I can get a similar effect by re-enabling that IP output on this, and then just disabling the output at the end. And so to kind of get into the logging that you can see on this unit, the alarms tab is where you can go to see current alarms. And so that's where that IP output error was popping up as I removed the output from channel 1. And that's where you go to see anything that's currently in a bad system state. So that correlates to that alarm LED that pops up on the front panel there. So if there's anything wrong on the system, that would pop up on this page or reflect up on the system status in the top right corner. You'll also see that red LED on the front panel, so you can check offhand if you have a number of units that you don't want to log into right out the gate. You can see pretty quickly which ones have some kind of alarm going on. And then the logging is kind of the forensic accounting of the alarms page. So anything that shows up on the alarms page and becomes cleared will present itself on the logging page. And as you can see, not everything that shows up in the logging is necessarily bad or an alarm. It might just be something as simple as when I updated the system time last. But it's a good way if you're having intermittent problems on your stream or on your channel to see, okay, well, this thing's flapping at high noon on a given time on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Maybe there's some weird anomaly that's going on there. Help you to investigate where that issue is and give you some readouts on that. And similar to how we talked about in the PowerPoint where we have that automation with SNMP, we also have SMPTE Trapping on these units, so you can use that to send off to a SNMP server, so you could get autonomous, like, hey, I have an alarm at this time. Gives you a little more response time to look into that more quickly. Check that. Good. Okay. Cool. And so then I'll just kind of show that again here with that that channel. So if I disable the IP input on this side, you can kind of see the SDI being affected on the downstream as well. So this would be on the actual output side, and that just kind of outputs a raster if there's an issue with that IP to SDI. Yeah. And this is just kind of a thumbnail view from our Omnitech SDI monitor. So it's not necessarily it's choppy in real time. It's just showing presence of the stream basically on that output. So I think that for the most part is about everything that there is to know about this particular implementation and how you'd go about setting it up and how you'd kind of go either SDI to IP or handle that IP to SDI receive. Are there any questions just on the information that was presented on the PowerPoint or on the web demo?
I have one.
Yeah.
So essentially, the SDI2X is a bidirectional gateway based upon what the user might need.
Yeah. So if you have like a fiber network or something along those lines, then you need to fork some of those streams off for SDI monitoring. You could just go straight IP to SDI, or if you have a few SDI streams coming off of legacy equipment that you need to implement into your network, then you can go the other way with it and do SDI to IP, and you can do a little mixing and matching as we're doing in this particular implementation as well.
So back in the analog days when we had D to A and A to D, this is D to IP or IP to D.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, your digital to
yeah. And I marvel at when the transition began to occur to IP. We didn't call them converters anymore. We ended up calling them gateways.
Yeah, I think that the term that we typically use is gateway. I've been using the term
Right.
converter a lot just as a sort of connotation, but we technically call this SDI to IP gateway would be a better way of putting it.
And another question I have is, how does the device, or does the device have any intelligence related to NMOS, to any of discovery or any of that kind of stuff?
Okay, just a moment here. As far as I'm aware,
Did you want me to answer that one, Blaze? This is Aaron.
Yeah, go for it. I talked to Jake about it, but I think you'd be a better authority on that anyway. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, hey, this is Aaron Doughton with Sencore, one of the product managers here. So NMOS has been a conversation for all of the 2110 Sencore products. We actually don't have it in this particular product right now, but we are looking at implementing it here, hopefully in like Q4 at the latest. But yes, it will have that. But for right now, it just uses like a basic form of SDP or just manual configuration. So yeah, it's definitely something that we know we need to add for sure.
All right.
Yep.
Well, thank you.
Will that be a firmware update or
It'll
no?
just be just a software upgrade to it. So it'll be something that just comes along with the product, not a license or anything weird. It would just be added later. That'd be a free upgrade.
Hey, this is Tom. Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Sure.
So, SMPTE 2110 and other standards. How about NDI? I know that's probably not a question I should ask from SMPTE, but
We do get that question every once in a while, but we do not have support for that at the moment. Or actually, any of our products do, but we're aware of it, I guess. But we've focused on 2110 specifically, and actually starting to focus on even the 2110-22 and JPEG XS and stuff like that is kind of where I guess our customer base has been yanking us is towards that side of it versus NDI. But yeah.
is it a big cost issue to be able to do other IP standards like NDI or anything else? That, I mean, no crystal ball. You don't know what next standard's going to be, but
right.
Is it a challenge either financially, it's expensive to do, or is it hard to do to be able to do that? Is that like changing the chipset kind of thing?
Like to flip flop between NDI and 2110, or
no, to build other IP standards into the same box.
Oh, no, I would say, well, I would say no. Just, I mean, I guess if you've adopted 2110, you usually have the horsepower already, like FPGA processing horsepower to be able to like implement things like JPEG XS is a really good example of that actually, because the same hardware, just because of how lightweight that codec is, can typically be built into other things as well. So that's more of an evolution, I guess, of a platform than it would be like a complete ground up rebuild. And you actually end up saving bandwidth in the long run anyway with JPEG XS, and maintaining like the crazy low latency and all that great stuff. And that's been something we've had our eye on. It's most likely not going to be in this particular product. We have another product that does JPEG XS over 2110 and transport stream and all that great stuff. But yeah, I would say I don't think it's a cost thing. I think it's just a matter of you know, when the thing was originally designed, can it support it? And usually the answer is yes, just how lightweight that stuff is. So I
Okay,
hope that
thank
answered
you.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it's very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
What do you find is the most common use case for this product? What are your customers telling you?
Really, it's we get a lot of top of rack conversion with the AG card, so the one that goes into the open gear chassis. So in those cases, we can do up to 40 turnarounds in 2RU, which, so if you have a bunch of SDI infrastructure, you can do a pretty quick turnaround into 2110, and then you just have all those IP feeds, you know, kind of just hanging around in your IP network now without having to do a lot of, you know, ground up rebuild or trying to. It's just an easy way to transition legacy SDI stuff into 2110. For the SDI2X though, that Blaze focused on, a lot of people will actually just strap them to the back of monitors and receive 2110 and turn it around to HDMI, and then just feed like consumer TVs or broadcast monitors and stuff like that with the HDMI output. That one's like, it's a pretty popular application that we've seen. Which
Yep,
seems
makes
extremely simple, but
Makes sense.
it was one of those things we weren't really expecting to see very much. But there's a lot of people strapping them back to monitors and stuff.
Any other questions? Okay, Blaze, thank you very much for the presentation. Appreciate it.
So do I. Thank you.
At this point, go ahead. Go ahead, John, were you saying something?
Blazes,
I was just going to say so did I. I appreciated the time they took to go ahead and visit with us about this, and I appreciate the invitation coming across from SMPTE to join the Philadelphia section to enjoy this.
Yeah, thanks,
Welcome.
Mark,
I'm glad you could
for
join
putting
us.
it together.
You're quite welcome. Thanks, Tom, for your help. Blaze, thanks for your help and your support team there that helped you as well. At this point, we're gonna close this section of the meeting. Blaze, again, thank you for the presentation. We are going to record it and we'll put it up on YouTube in a little bit. We see it in a day or two. We do have a couple of future upcoming meetings. One will be a format and flavor, and another is pending on probably something from VisRT coming in August, September. So that's what's planned so far. If you guys have any ideas or suggestions, please don't hesitate to email me or email Philadelphia SMPTE with them. So that being said, anybody else have any other questions?
I was just gonna mention that if you haven't already been to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, by all means, take the trip over that way. It's a very cool town.
I've heard that about
That's on my list.
South Dakota in general.
Yep.
But Mark, I would love to hear from Pete again. I don't know what he's been doing with CES and everything like that, but I always like to hear from him once a year.
Okay.
So,
I haven't heard anything from him.
yeah, I don't know what he's up to or what he's writing about or what he's experiencing with this. Well, maybe he's got plans now for NAB or whatever, but always like to hear his perspective on the ebb and flow of technology in the consumer side.
Who is this you're
Okay,
referring
Greg.
to?
I'll reach out to him.
Pete Putman.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he's
Yeah,
always
I'll reach out to him
entertaining.
and see if he'll do a presentation.
Yeah, he's always entertaining.
Oh, yeah.
You might have to wait
Blaze
till
back,
till
dropped off there.
deeper into the fall after the trade shows and stuff. So.
And he never has an opinion.
All right, guys. See ya. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Take care,
everybody.
everyone.
I appreciate it.
Thanks
Have a
very
great
much.
day.
Yeah, you as well. And Blaze, if you could email me the link to this and I'll share it with Tom, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's no problem.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a great afternoon.
All right. Thanks. You as well.